Well, 1863 is the decisive year of the American Civil War, and it certainly has an impact on Texas. In particular, the United States campaign to control the Mississippi River has a huge impact on Texas. Not only does it divide the Confederacy and separate the trans Mississippi states from the rest of the nation, but it also is a massive effort to forcibly emancipate as many slaves in the lower Mississippi Valley as possible. And with this massive emancipation process going on, this recovering of slave property and pushing it into federal lines, slavery is dealt a probably fatal wound in the process. Those slaves that fall into Union control or are emancipated by Union forces then become liable to conscription and are in fact put into the Army. In order to avoid this, Louisiana, Arkansas, and other enslaved owners in other states refugee their slaves and themselves, their households, into Texas. And in fact, the slave population of Texas increases by about 100,000 during the course of the war, and most of it happens in 1863. So slavery is essentially creating a redoubt, a last refuge in Texas during the course of this war. Well, Texas troops are involved in fighting across the Confederacy. There's Texans at Gettysburg, there's Texans at Vicksburg, but there's a lot of Texans involved in campaigns in Louisiana and somewhat in Arkansas as well. The Union, in fact, does try to invade Texas. After the Mississippi falls, they're ready to finish them off, take Texas, finish off Louisiana, get these places sorted out, and get them back into the Union so that they can help them pass a constitutional amendment outlawing slavery forever. But Union efforts at Sabine Pass in September of 1863 fail dramatically. Dick Dowling, just a company level commander with an artillery unit along with about 40 Houstonians, turned back an invasion force of about 5,000. It's just the kind of victory Texans love. But elsewhere, Union troops successfully land and occupy the lower Rio Grande Valley and the Texas coast as far north as nearly the mouth of the Brazos. And their plan is to capture Houston. And if they can take Houston, they believe that Texas will in fact collapse. The Confederacy is clearly doomed, if not by the middle of 1863, certainly by the end of 1863. So many Texans are busy trying to figure out how to accommodate this slow winding down of the war and come out of it unscathed or harmed as little as possible. Well, the trans-Mississippi states, the trans-Mississippi Confederate states, are essentially cut off from the rest of their country. And so they become essentially semi-autonomous. The commander of this department, a general by the name of Edmund Kirby Smith, becomes essentially a potentate in his own right. Well, what does he do? He turns Texas into the great entrepot, the great importer of war material for his new domain. And in fact, Texas becomes extraordinarily benefited by its unique geography and its location. However, all is not sunshine and roses, as you can imagine. Unionist refugees continue to leave Texas and try to make their way to New Orleans, where they can then join the Union Army and to help suppress the rebellion. Union troops, surprisingly, in 1864, abandoned their campaign, which I would argue was just on the cusp of total success. They abandon that campaign and instead fall back into Louisiana, ostensibly because the federal government says we need Louisiana conquered and cleaned up before you go and try to tackle Texas. Texas is just so big. And so all these Union troops that had spent that fall moving up the Texas coast are now back in lower Louisiana. And from there, they will launch a coordinated campaign along with the United States Navy and Union troops operating out of Little Rock, Arkansas, and all converge on Shreveport, Louisiana, which is Kirby Smith's headquarters. So instead of knocking Houston out and taking Texas out of the equation, which would essentially isolate Louisiana and make it untenable, instead, federal authorities decide that they would rather go for the headquarters and leave the supply line open. Crazy, I know, but that's what they do. And in fact, Texans leave Texas, rush into Louisiana, oppose this invasion, and in fact, deliver a severe check to this Union invasion at Mansfield, and then pursue Union troops out of Louisiana, essentially pursue both sides of this Union invasion. But it's Texans that essentially come to the rescue and complete those campaigns. Well, after the end of this Red River campaign, as it becomes known, what becomes of Texas in the Civil War? Well, Texas essentially, theoretically, can be invaded at any time, but the new regime in the federal army, this one led by Ulysses S. Grant, finally, is the commander of all Union forces, they're not going to mess with Texas anymore. They're just going to let it wither on the vine, so to speak. So Texas really doesn't have a huge threat of invasion by federal forces. However, there's plenty of other stuff to occupy their time. Indians are starting to raid the frontier again, in particular the Comanches, given a respite from their disasters of the 1850s and largely ignored by whites as a result of the Civil War, have gained enough strength to once again start trying to get their raiding and trading empire set back to right. Texas's position as a conduit for Confederate goods out and import goods in continue to bring a level of prosperity to Texas that it might not otherwise have enjoyed. And Texas beef raisers even start driving their cattle, now that they can't get to Confederate forces, to Union forces out west. They send them out to New Mexico, feed federal garrisons there. They drive them into Old Mexico, where they're then shipped to the coast and sent north to feed Union armies. You know, they're looking for currency and they're looking for paying customers, and the Confederacy can't pay their bills. Now, there's a little dust up at the end of the American Civil War, happens down in May in the lower Rio Grande Valley at a place called Palmito Ranch, and that is oftentimes pointed to as the last battle of the American Civil War. What it actually is a skirmish at best, and is far from particularly interesting, frankly. But a lot of people like to point to it as being the final guns of the Civil War, which I don't believe it was. But that's for another story. So, what's the tally sheet? Texas troops, probably about 90,000 of them served. 90,000 Texans served at one time or another in the Confederate Army. Of those 90,000, 20,000 became casualties of either gunshot wounds, artillery rounds. They were killed, they were wounded, or they died of diseases. Texans saw action in every theater, virtually every theater of the war. And Texas, in fact, was invaded, but in a very limited way. Texas benefited from its geographical position in the Confederacy and prospered from commercial activity that grew during the course of the American Civil War. So at the end of the day, Texas suffered very little in terms of damage and loss of life in the American Civil War compared to the other Confederate states.